The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The rise of the internet economy has allowed people to carry out a variety of new types of economic transactions. One of the more intriguing developments in this history has been the emergence of websites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo, which allow for peer-to-peer crowdfunding. But what exactly is crowdfunding? What is it being used for? And how much might crowdfunding potentially change our economy? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss the economics of crowdfunding is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. John Dove. Welcome back to the show, John.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, we're going to be shaking things up a little bit here, and you're going to be asking me the questions. So why don't we get started?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Again, crowdfunding is a platform that's really developed over the past couple of years and has become much bigger in recent times. But I think it's something that a lot of people aren't really very familiar with. So maybe we could start there. Firms, probably the biggest firm right now is Kickstarter. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the industry itself and also Kickstarter.
Yeah, thanks. And again, thanks for coming on to ask the questions today. So Kickstarter was started in 2009, and it started as this platform where you could allow peer-to-peer funding. And then with the peer-to-peer funding, since it also allows for the aggregation of rather small contributions from a large number of individuals, that's where we get the term crowdfunding. So instead of turning, if you have a business idea, want to try to get a new product to market, instead of turning to a small number of individuals, like say a bank for a loan or venture capitalist for some financing, you could rely on the crowd. You could assemble contributions from hundreds or even thousands of individuals. So I think probably more basic would be the idea of peer-to-peer funding. They would go directly from people looking to fund projects to people with ideas. And that's what Kickstarter allows. It started in 2009. It's probably the largest of the sites in terms of the volume of financing that is done. It has about 12 million different members, and it's funded almost $2.7 billion worth of projects over the years, and a little over 100,000 successfully funded projects. So they've had some quite large projects in there. Probably the other most popular or most well-known site is Indiegogo, which actually started a little bit earlier, started in 2008 and emerged out of some sharing technologies. Indiegogo has about 11 million members who've contributed about $950 million, and they've actually funded a larger number of projects, about 650,000 projects. So a little bit smaller projects. Also, one thing that's a little bit different with Indiegogo is that they do more in terms of not really charitable giving, but giving for good causes through their generosity website, which is a portion of the Indiegogo site.
That's really interesting. So I know along with those two, there are obviously a number of other similar sites as well, but some of these might be a bit more specialized. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Kickstarter and Indiegogo fund a wide range of different projects, but a couple of them emerged to crowdfund research by academics like ourselves. And one is experiment.com and another is Rocket Hub. Experiment.com has about 61,000 members, and they funded just under 600 projects over there. So obviously a lot smaller, newer. They're serving a niche market. They've had some relatively large, more science, more medical-based experiments. But the typical project, research project that might be on experiment.com is more on the lines of about $2,000 or $3,000. So relatively small funding source for academic standards. And then Rocket Hub is another one they've entered into a partnership with the A&E Television Network to feature some of the research that's being funded on there. Although right now they were recently bought out by another company, and so right now they are being their website is under redesign. So right now they are in the process of retooling, but they had gotten a major infusion of capital from when they were purchased.
So I guess stay tuned to Rocket Hub then.
Yeah.
So based on that, one thing that I'm interested about, especially given that I still really don't know a lot behind it, but what is sort of the technology and also the economics that goes behind it, and then how is it that these firms are serving this market, and how are they going about accomplishing that?
Well, yeah. So let's see. We have a number of different models in place. These are generally for-profit companies. Now, Kickstarter, interestingly enough, in 2015, they reincorporated as what's known as a benefit corporation. So they have this broader idea of serving the greater societal good through specifically crowdfunding, as opposed to exclusively pursuing profit. But these are for-profit companies. They charge a fee. Based on in many cases about 8% is typical. In some other cases they'll charge 5%. So if you raise $1 million in there, there'll be an 8% of fee that would go to the website to pay their expenses or to allow them to make a profit. Now, one thing I will notice is that Indiegogo, for their generosity portion of their website, they waive that fee. So they don't actually charge that fee for raising money for good causes. So they knew that, I guess, differentiate themselves maybe a little bit from Kickstarter or to generate some different brand name capital as well. So you have a lot of, these are for-profit sites. They provide, similar to some of the other platforms for sharing that we've seen emerge, like say Uber or Airbnb. They do provide sort of the economics of it is sort of a centralization. That if you're both somebody who's looking to fund things and then also somebody looking to have something funded, that you can go to a place like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, and previously to this, people might try and do fundraising appeals on their own website, which could be good, but is rather limited in that only people who already know of the existence of your website would be the ones going there. So there's sort of some agglomeration or centralization of a whole bunch of different projects. You can have hundreds of projects up on Kickstarter at any given time, and so millions of people know about it, and so who are either looking to get something funded or looking to contribute, they know to go there. Another thing that contributes to the economics of this is that because they have this common platform, they're able to raise money from relatively small contributions and in effect to bring the crowd into governments here. Previously, transactions costs would have been so high that it would have been impossible to give like $5 or $10 to a charitable cause or to help somebody out, who lives thousands of miles from where you are. I mean, if you were to give that kind of small-scale assistance, it would have to be face-to-face or completely direct. So by lowering the transactions costs, you're able to get really small, you can make small contributions, small donations economically viable. So that I think is another important component of the economics of what's going on here.
You think you could explain real quick what a transaction cost is, just for the viewers out there?
Yeah, transactions costs are what it costs. We use this term to refer to essentially the cost of making or carrying out different transactions. So it can include things like transportation. It can include things like simply finding the person to trade with, and many times that's really, really significant. Or if you don't even know where to look to try to find somebody to trade with, you don't even try to trade.
Right.
And then it can also refer to the cost of making and enforcing contracts. So if you were going to have some type of a clearinghouse that was going to charge processing fees, then that would be a type of transactions cost. So with these platforms, that are allowing you to collect contributions from hundreds or thousands of different individuals with very little in the way of additional cost of somebody clicking to decide to contribute $10 or $20 to a project. Then you can do that feasibly.
Sounds like they're really providing a very important service then, so that's great. Now, given that, I'm curious, especially since they are relatively newer, are these sites actually funding anything of significance? Are there really any significant projects out there, or is it really just a lot of very small projects? It sounds like there are hundreds, if not thousands, of projects currently, but what's kind of the relative size here?
Some have gotten quite large. Pebble, which is a maker of smartphones and smart watches, I think actually, had 2 different funding rounds on Kickstarter, and they raised $30 million for the startup to get their products to market. On the top there is the coolest cooler idea, and they raised $13 million for their startup, and then the Ubuntu smartphone raised, I think, around $13 million, and then FlowHive, an idea for a beehive where you can get honey at home, they raised around $12 million this way. So there are a number of different projects. To date, there's been over 80 projects on Kickstarter and Indiegogo that have raised $1 million or more. So quite significant amounts of money. And like I said, overall, we're up in the billions of dollars.
Right.
And then I just also had mentioned that there's Ethereum, which is a new type of cryptocurrency and similar to Bitcoin, and they also have a blockchain for it. So they're very similar to blockchain, but they've raised money through crowdfunding, through a different platform, their own platform, as opposed to either Kickstarter or Indiegogo. And they've raised tens of millions of dollars, including one project where they raised as much as reported $160 million. They've raised almost $200 million through a number of different projects. So that's getting up to be some fairly significant amounts of money.
Yeah, definitely. Now, another thing that this seems tied to, and I know when I was in grad school, this was a name that came up a lot, was Muhammad Yunus, who started this whole idea of microfinance in Bangladesh, and it's spread in a number of other places. So I'm wondering, maybe you could very briefly just talk a little bit about microfinance, and then also talk about how that might relate or not relate to these crowdfunding sources and sites. Well,
that's a good point, because microfinance was the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, and Muhammad Yunus was a PhD economist. He got his PhD in economics at Vanderbilt, and was a professor of economics in Bangladesh. And he came up with the idea of trying to have a bank to offer very small loans in the size of even like $5 or $10 to people in Bangladesh who needed small amounts of money. But although a poor country like Bangladesh, $5 or $10 is a more substantial sum, and especially when it was starting back some decades ago, to try to make these very small loans. Now, it wasn't necessarily going to be highly profitable, because you have transactions costs, and normal banks wouldn't look to touch this. But with the idea of trying to serve poor people, giving the small loans. Now, microfinance amounts were relatively small, but it did tend to be a bit more peer-to-peer in terms of going outside of the traditional banking institutions. So it was a new type of bank. It allowed people who were looking to invest their money to assist the poor in this fashion, a new channel for investment. So there's some similarities. I think in some ways you could think of Kickstarter and Indiegogo as almost like a Grameen Bank writ large. It could be worldwide, and also because on the web end up being able to serve much larger sums of money.
Do you think that in that sense then, do you think that maybe some of these crowdfunding sites might one day take over what it is that microfinance is doing then, and I guess ultimately replace it?
It certainly might replace microfinance because it does allow for the peer-to-peer connections and for some very small amounts of money. So in theory, if you wanted to do a very small transaction or assist somebody with just a few dollars so they could engage in some venture that hopefully could make money and help lift a family out of poverty, you can do this using the technology.
Huh. Okay, so what about something then more in the developed world, even thinking about business investment and where most of that generally comes from, typically banking, things like that. So could it also possibly replace or even compete against the banking industry, I suppose, at some point?
It may, but I think this is a case is a little. You have to talk about this a little bit because you have to get into some of the functions that banks or venture capitalists would actually be providing. And I think some people are very bullish on peer-to-peer and crowdfunding investment are sort of forgetting some of the benefits or some of the services that traditional banks or venture capitalists, as I think many people now see on the show Shark Tank, these institutions and individuals are providing important services. One of which is for the banks, they're providing intermediation of a form of by collecting the deposits from thousands of different individuals, and then bundling them together. They're able to make loans that aren't tied to the money that's coming from any one saver, and that ends up being tremendously beneficial for the economy. There's a sort of extra liquidity that arises. And so to some extent, banks were there to aggregate the deposits of lots of savers so that you didn't have to go peer-to-peer. So there's some tremendous advantages of that if you want to take out a loan and I had some money to lend you, that your loan wasn't tied to my money directly. Because if it was, and you were trying to start a business, when I decide I want my money back, I've got to get calling your loan, and if your business isn't started yet, you're almost surely going to cause a small and struggling emerging business to fail.
Right.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that the people who work for banks who are looking to make loans or are venture capitalists, like the sharks on Shark Tank, have a tremendous amount of specialized knowledge in terms of simply being a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge in terms of identifying ideas that are going to have a chance to be successful. I mean, surely we live in an economy where most new businesses fail and most ventures end up not making a lot of money. But venture capitalists like the sharks have a little bit better chance, I think, due to their knowledge of identifying that project that's going to end up succeeding. Because when I watch Shark Tank, a lot of the projects almost everything sounds great when they come on there, but they're able to see through and see some problems or see some limitations that you or I don't, and that's because they have some specialized knowledge. And so and then they also, once they get involved with the project, they're bringing some skills that they have in terms of how to make a small business work. So I think peer-to-peer crowdfunding for startup businesses is an interesting idea. It's certainly providing new sources of funding. It creates some new opportunities in the economy. But before we think that the existing or traditional means of finance are going to be dead, we have to recognize that there's a lot of services that banks and venture capitalists provide, and they have a lot of specialized knowledge. And you or I, the average person on Kickstarter, is simply not going to have that kind of knowledge, and so we're not going to be making as good of investment decisions.
Huh. What about equity? I mean, if I'm an investor, if I'm funding something in one of these crowdsourcing sites, can I obtain equity in one of these companies?
Well, that's a really good question, and currently we can't. You're not going to be able to get equity or part ownership in a venture that's being promoted on Kickstarter. So it's really sort of the way it goes in many cases, really almost like pre-ordering a prototype product check. So you see like some new type of scooter or the coolest cooler, and you're essentially ordering one in advance, saying like, well, when we get this design or when we get this product ready to ship, you can you get it, and you can get it at a discount. So by pre-ordering, you get the product at a discount when it comes out, and And you're also then by committing to that order or giving the money in advance, you're helping the product get developed. But right now, due to financial regulations, they're not allowed to do equity through Kickstarter, Indiegogo, through crowdfunding. Now, we'll have to wait and see, because there's a whole bunch of regulations which essentially would be similar to what's known as an initial public offering of stock in a company. Right. And if you were to get equity in this case, it is possible that all those financial regulations, which are very, very burdensome, would have to apply to anybody who wants to try to raise some money for a business on Kickstarter. So it's not clear how that's going to develop, and it certainly as of right now, given that regulatory limitation, it certainly seems to be putting a ceiling on the options for crowdfunding.
What effect then might this have on charity, and charitable contributions?
Well, I think that's a case where we could see a lot more happen in this case. And this is perhaps one of the most famous instances of charitable giving for Karen Klein was a bus monitor who was bullied by the students on a bus in a video that got posted on the internet and went viral. And then somebody on Indiegogo saw this video and thought it was, felt very sorry for the woman who suffered this abuse. And so this is the actual funding that was posted on Indiegogo, and pointing out, well, she doesn't really earn enough money to take a real vacation, so let's raise $5,000 so we can send her on a well-deserved vacation. The goal was $5,000. They'd raised over $700,000 from thousands of people who saw it, who had seen her video, heard about this on Indiegogo, and just gave $10, $20, a relatively small amount. And it's interesting to point out, without getting a charitable tax deduction for this. So a lot of the charity that's going on here is not through tax deductions, but it's allowing people to connect to others that they see and they want to try to help out. And in some ways, it's not completely dissimilar from what we see going on through social media in the aftermath of disasters. There's been a whole bunch of assistance that's been able to be targeted to individuals who are in need of assistance after a disaster, and it's being coordinated through Twitter or Facebook groups that get established, and it was just individuals who have something that they can, if you need a generator or if you need some medicine, one individual who has it can reach out and give it to somebody who needs it, and with getting connected through social media. So in many ways, I think some of what's going on with Indiegogo and the charitable issues are similar to what we see parallel efforts out there. And in this case, maybe cutting out the middleman of the organized charities might end up being an effective thing, because if you can rely enough on the reputation of the website of the platform so you have enough trust that the person that you're the thing that you're contributing to is an actual person and they actually have that that need, I think there's quite a bit of potential here.
Oh, that's really interesting. I wonder too, another issue, statistic that I found interesting was the fact that Kickstarter actually raises more money for the arts than the National Endowment of the Arts. So given that, what sort of potential might you see there for something like Kickstarter to affect arts and artistic projects?
I think this is another area where it's there's quite a bit of potential, and in part because we've never really relied on the National Endowment for the Arts to a great extent. The arts have been largely funded through patrons throughout history. And so it's really sort of the patron and patronage model that's supported a lot of the arts over the years. And in that way, Kickstarter or Indiegogo are simply broadening the base. Historically, what you'd have to be is, you'd have to have just the transactions cost meant that if you were a struggling artist or sculptor and you were looking for a patron, you generally had to go to one patron or a couple of patrons and try to get a substantial amount of money from a small number of patrons. this really allows people to, allows you to broaden the base and get small amounts of money from large numbers of individuals. And it also means that somebody who doesn't have the money to be a true patron of the arts can get involved for whatever amount that they want to do. If they can afford to give support the arts or individual artists to the tune of $100 or $200 or $500 in a year, they can do that. And we have the technology now and the low transactions cost to allow that to happen. So in this case, given that we're taking a historical model that's really been the way we funded the arts, and we're just broadening the base and extending it and bringing a lot more individuals, a lot more money in, and then also allowing us to support probably a lot more artists that we couldn't otherwise. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of potential here.
What about scientific research and technological development, things like that? Do we see these sources or these sites funding scientific projects? Or if not, what sort of potential might there be there?
Well, before you get into that, I just want to mention one other thing, because one of the other sites that we had a logo up there for was something called Patreon. And that provides provides support for a lot of other creators on the internet, typically people who are like bloggers or YouTubers or doing podcasts. And it allows, in effect, if you read somebody's blog and you like their blog, what you can do is you can, in effect, sort of tip them for it. I think it was sort of like tipping through Patreon. And again, with the low transactions cost, it allows people to give like $5 or $10 to somebody who's blogging. And so, although bloggers or YouTubers might get a small amount of money through something like Patreon, they're also able to collect ads, get some money from ads through things like YouTube. And when you're getting viewers on YouTube, you can get some ad support. And so, although the amounts of money in that case are going to be small, it could on the margin be the kind of extra $500 a month or $1,000 a month that might help support a blogger or a YouTuber, because it doesn't have to provide full support. It's in conjunction with other ways that they can get some support. So now let's go on to the research question. Research, there are some research projects up there, and so as I mentioned through experiment.com and Rocket Hub, they are funding some academic research projects. Now, one of the things I think is kind of really interesting about this is two things. It allows us to tap into a lot of popular support for science. People have a lot of interest in science. They watch shows on the Discovery Channel or National Geographic. You think of people who have subscribed to National Geographic or Smithsonian Magazine. At some level, they're sort of patronizing research. And so this allows sites like experiment.com would allow those individuals now to give small amounts of money to help fund research projects. So I think that's one thing that's pretty significant. Another thing that ended up being pretty significant in this is that although you could make an argument there's a need for government support of academic research, there's not necessarily an argument for the government to define or to in fact dictate what that research should be. And so one thing that's kind of nice about a platform is that if people are just putting projects up on a platform like that, then it really sort of takes away sort of the gatekeeper function of the National Science Foundation and National Institutes for Health. And in the limiting case, if you want to think really outside the box, the National Science Foundation might not be putting out their own grant or request for grant proposals. They could simply be going on to these research sites and choosing what projects to invest. And if they were doing that, it would be a different way of allocating our tax dollars that might end up changing what we're doing quite a bit.
Huh. Wow, that's very interesting.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, so thanks, John, for coming on and asking the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.